Much different perspective today than you may hear from all the transportation meetings that have been going around the Bay for, I would say, the last few months, but it's not only that, the last few years and even the last few decades. So we have a wonderful, wonderful program lined up for you today. Just a little commercial plug. This conference today is brought to you by the American Dream Coalition. And what is the website? Is it American Dream?
AmericanDreamCoalition.org.
There you go, that's simple, AmericanDreamCoalition.org. And that is an organization that has over 100 experts as members from across the country and actually across the world. And their mission is to working for freedom, mobility, and affordable home ownership. And they meet annually for very large conferences. However, this year they've decided to hit the road and try and do these mini conferences in some of the localities so they can spread their message a little bit further, and they're a little bit smaller, a little more intimate. And that's good for you because you'll be able to ask some questions and maybe get to talk to them during lunch and some of the breaks that we may have. So that commercial break. What we're going to talk about today, we're actually going to talk about mobility, rather what you hear from the other side, which is usually about increasing options. And we're going to talk about how to fix congestion, truly fix congestion, not just have something and call it fixing congestion. We're going to talk about free market solutions to transportation. We're going to talk about wants versus needs. And we're going to talk about, again, free market solutions versus kind of the crony capitalism that unfortunately we see too much that gets injected in these conversations. So with that, I'd like to introduce our first panel, and if they could come up and sit here. First off is Randal O'Toole, and of course my phone with the introductions is on delay, so let me pull that up. And also Mr. John Charles. And I'll go ahead and give you their bios, and then they can one by one come up and give their talks. Randal is a senior fellow with the Cato Institute, and he works on urban growth, public land, and transportation issues. He's an author of several books, and I'm going to hold on and get a prop. This book here, it's called Gridlock, Why We're Stuck in Traffic and What to Do About It. I think this was published in 2009, and Sharon and I and a couple other folks from Tampa had gone to their annual conference that just that year happened to be, in 2010, happened to be in Orlando. And we bought each a copy of this book and highlighted it, dog-eared it, carried this around. Both of us had carried this around the entire 5 months that we were fighting the tax referendum in 2010. So he's got a few of these for sale, so I highly encourage that. You take a look if you can. So that is Randal. And then John Charles is here to talk about transit-oriented development. He's president and CEO of the Cascade Policy Institute. His research has focused on transportation, land use, and free market environmentalism. He is a frequent keynote speaker and a guest lecturer, especially on the subject of growth management, and has traveled to 24 states to discuss the issue. Prior to joining the Institute, Mr. Charles was executive director of the Oregon Environmental Council for 17 years. During that time, he served on dozens of local, state, and federal commissions and advisory boards related to environmental protection. Charles was also an active participant in Oregon legislative proceedings and helped author numerous environmental statutes in the interest of forest management, toxic substances, air pollution, watershed restoration, and transportation. And I'm going to put one more quote out there for your consideration before Randal comes up. And I don't have it, but I remember it. They have been trying to get rail in Tampa Bay for many years, and a year ago the CEO of HART was asked about the status, and you know what she said? She said, "We're so far behind, we're ahead." And by that she meant that we're not tied, or at least the way I took it, maybe it's not the way she meant it, but we're not tied to debt, and we have kind of a clean slate to go off to some true mobility solutions. But with that, I'd like to introduce Randal O'Toole.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here and help people out. We've been working on these issues for a long time, and I finally feel optimistic about the future of public transit. And by that I mean I feel optimistic that it's going away, because it's a huge albatross. It costs $50 billion a year to subsidize something that hardly anybody uses, and I think it's the most heavily subsidized consumer-based industry in the country, and the sooner we can get rid of it, the better off we are. Now, instead of getting rid of it, what we see is people trying to regionalize it. Instead of having a transit agency for Hillsborough and Pinellas and Pasco counties, they want a regional transit agency for the entire region. And this woman is Jane Jacobs. She was an architecture critic, and in about 1960 she wrote that a region, let's see if I can get this to work, is an area safely larger than the last area for whose problems we found no solution. Now, about the time she was writing this, Congress was passing a law requiring every urban area in the country to form a regional government to plan the future of their transportation. These regional governments are called metropolitan planning organizations. Some of them have a lot of power, like the one for Portland. Some of them have much less power, like the ones down here, but every region is required to have one. And so, for example, this is pretty fast here. We have Hillsborough's MPO calls themselves Plan Hillsborough. Pinellas calls themselves Forward Pinellas, but basically they're the MPOs. And I'm too fast. And the problem is nobody knows what transportation is going to be like 20 years from now. They're all required to write 20-year transportation plans, and so they write what they know about. And what they know about is what transportation used to be like. And so they write transportation plans for what transportation used to be instead of what it's going to be. Okay, here's the Hillsborough 2040 plan. 2040, that's more than 20 years away. And right now in Hillsborough County, or in the plan, calls for spending about 44% of all transportation dollars on public transit. Well, that would probably be appropriate in New York City, where half of all travel is by public transit. But in Hillsborough County, only 1.6% of commuters take transit to work. For all passenger travel, it's only 0.4% of passenger travel goes by transit. Oh, yes, there's something called freight. 0% of freight goes by transit, and yet they want to dedicate 44% of transportation dollars to transit. Pinellas County is even worse. They want to dedicate over half of all transportation dollars in the county to transit. Only 1.8% of commuters take transit to work in Pinellas County, and of course, zero freight takes transit. So they're totally ignoring freight when they say we're going to devote most of the resources to transit. So they're planning for the past. Now, in order to get people to ride transit, they want to build what they call transit-oriented developments. Now, John will be talking about these in a lot more detail, but I want to give you a little bit of history of transit-oriented developments. 125 years ago, a lot of people lived in real high-density housing in New York and Chicago and other big cities. It was called tenement housing, and it was awful. You had whole families living in one room, sometimes two families in one room, and you might have 8 families sharing one bathroom. And urban planners said, how are we going to get people out of this tenement housing? Well, they said, well, let's build rapid transit, and then people can get out of the tenement housing. The problem was nobody who lived in housing like that could afford to ride public transit. It was a nickel ride. It was a fare to ride rapid transit was a nickel, and they couldn't afford that. They maybe earned 50 cents a day or $1 a day, so a nickel ride, round trip would be 10 cents. That'd be 10% to 20% of their income. They couldn't afford it. So all the rapid transit in the world didn't help people get out of tenement housing. What helped people? Henry Ford's automobile. which he made so cheap, and he paid his workers so well that they could afford to get out of tenement housing. And when everybody started imitating Ford's moving assembly lines, then people were able to move out, buy small houses out of the city, and then commute to the city, or actually commute to the suburbs because the jobs moved to the suburbs at the same time that the people moved to the suburbs. And so what happened was the former tenement housing emptied out, and in a lot of cities they just tore it down. And in New York City they proposed to tear down this neighborhood, which is called Greenwich Village, because it was emptying out. They called it a slum. And this woman, Jane Jacobs, who happened to live there. And she wanted to prove it wasn't a slum. So she wrote a book called The Death and Life of Great American Cities, trying to show that her neighborhood, Greenwich Village, wasn't a slum. Okay, the urban planners read her book. They said, she's right, we were wrong, we shouldn't tear out her neighborhood. And in fact, her neighborhood sounds so wonderful. She made it sound so great in the book that their goal was to turn every city and suburb in this country into Greenwich Village. So we have, in Portland, they're building what they call affordable housing, these 5- and 6-story buildings, just like Greenwich Village, with shops on the ground floor, and then upper stories are apartments. And some of the apartments are as small as 660 square feet, and they sell for like $300,000, and they call that affordable housing. That's essentially, they call it transit-oriented development, but they really mean tenement-oriented development. That's the history of transit-oriented development. Now, Tampa, St. Petersburg is considered by the Census Bureau to be an urban area. It includes a little bit of Pasco County, about 50% of Hillsborough County, all of Pinellas County. It's about 800 square miles. And when I say Tampa, St. Petersburg, or Tampa, St. Pete, or TSP, I'm referring to this yellow area because that's well tracked by the census data. Now, why doesn't transit work in this area? The data show that if you travel by transit in 60 minutes, you can reach, again, it skipped a slide there. This is very annoying, Karen. If you travel by transit in 60 minutes, you can't reach as many jobs as you can reach in 10 minutes by car. You see what we're saying here is in 10 minutes by car, you can reach this many jobs. In an hour by car, you can reach this many jobs. In an hour by transit, you can reach this many jobs. And in 10 minutes by transit, it doesn't even show. It's like 100 jobs or something. This is for the average resident of the Tampa St. Pete urban area. So transit doesn't work because it doesn't reach very many jobs, or it takes a long time to get there. That's why only 1.6% of people are riding transit to work. Now, San Francisco, you'd think it would be a lot better because they have so much transit. They have so many trains and buses and BARTs and light rail and commuter trains and so on and so forth. And yet, in San Francisco, what did I do? There we go. San Francisco, you can reach more jobs in 20 minutes by car than you can reach in an hour by transit. It's a little better than Tampa, but not a lot better. So it doesn't even work that well in San Francisco. And it only works in San Francisco not because they have rail transit, not because they have BART, not because they have commuter trains. It works primarily because they have 300,000 jobs in downtown San Francisco. And it turns out transit ridership is proportional to the number of jobs. The more jobs you have in downtown, the higher the transit ridership. New York isn't down here. New York is way up here, but it's on the line. 2 million jobs, and 30% of people take transit to work in New York. So, in New York urban area. So, San Francisco's up here, Tampa's down there. You're not going to turn Tampa St. Pete into San Francisco Oakland. You're not going to turn that 30,000 jobs here into 300,000 jobs. It's never going to happen. So transit is never going to work here. It's never going to be an important mode of travel, even though the Hillsborough and Pinellas County MPOs want to spend over half their money on transit. Okay? Right now, there's very few people who actually need transit. Only 2.8% of workers in Tampa St. Pete have no cars in their households. Now, some of those people probably could afford cars, they don't want them, but only 2.8% have no cars. And how do they get to work? Well, it turns out only 18% of people who have no cars take transit. More than a third of them drive alone to work. How do they drive alone if they have no car? I presume that they're driving in an employer-supplied car. Another 15% carpool. So only 18% of people who have no cars take transit. That's how bad transit is. The vast majority of people who don't have cars don't use it. And the people who do use transit are increasingly the rich. This is the growth in transit usage between 2010 and 2016 by income class. The poor people, it's declining. Now, to be fair, the number of poor people declined too. But the number of poor people who are using transit declined faster than the number of poor people declined. Meanwhile, the fastest growth in transit is in the $75,000 and up income classes. And right now, the median income of transit riders is significantly higher than the median income of workers across the country overall, and it's growing faster. So transit is increasingly used by the rich. So when we're talking about subsidizing transit, we're saying we're going to tax the poor to subsidize the rich and get them out of their cars, and everybody will be somehow better off. Transit subsidies are just gigantic compared to subsidies to driving and most other forms of travel. In 2015, subsidies to driving were 1.2 cents a passenger mile. And it was about $60 billion. That's a lot of money, but we get so many hundreds of billions of passenger miles out of that subsidy. It's only 1.2 cents a passenger mile. Nationwide subsidies to transit were about 90 cents a passenger mile, almost $1. So we're talking about 70 to 80 times as much subsidy per passenger mile for transit. Because Tampa St. Pete doesn't have much rail, it's cheaper here. So the subsidy here is only about 85 cents a passenger mile. It's still a lot, not quite as much as elsewhere, but still a lot more than driving. Since 1970, we have spent at least $1.3 trillion on transit, and that's through 2016. You add 2017 and 2018, that's another $100 billion, so it makes it $1.4 trillion. We don't actually know, we only have capital data from 1988 on, so we don't actually know how much this is, but it's probably about another $100 billion for probably $1.5 trillion on transit. And what do we got out of it? Well, transit, per capita transit ridership fell rapidly from 1960 to 1970. And in this period is when the subsidies really began. And you can see since then, it's been still falling, but much more slowly. So what we've done is we've slowed the decline of a dying industry. We haven't recovered anywhere. We haven't relieved congestion because we haven't taken any cars off the road. We've just slowed the number of additional cars on the road a little bit. It doesn't save energy. It doesn't reduce greenhouse gas emissions. It turns out driving your SUV uses less energy and produces less greenhouse gases than transit in Tampa St. Pete. This is energy, this is greenhouse gases for transit in the region versus driving a car and driving a light truck. Light trucks is pickups, SUVs, and full-size vans. So transit is the brown form of travel. If you want a green form of travel, get yourself a plug-in hybrid or something like that, but don't go encouraging people to build transit. The reason why it's so brown is because the buses run empty. The average bus in Hillsborough County has about 34 seats, and it runs around with 7 people on board. Pinellas County, the average bus has 37 seats, and it runs around with 6 people on board. So the occupancy rates, if you're driving a Lincoln Navigator and you're the only occupant in the vehicle, you still have a higher occupancy rate than buses in Pinellas County. transit doesn't stimulate urban growth. They're going to tell you, oh, transit generates economic development. Well, at best, it shuffles it around. It makes economic development happen in one part of the city instead of another part of the city, but it doesn't make regions grow faster. This compares the amount of money spent on transit in the 1990s, the capital improvements in the 1990s, versus population growth in the 2000s. If transit stimulated urban growth, then you'd have faster growth in the regions that spent the most money. But that's not what happens. The regions that spent the most money are the ones that grew the slowest, and the regions that grew the fastest are the ones that spent the least money on transit. Now, a lot of regions didn't spend much money on transit and still grew slow. So spending less doesn't mean you're going to grow faster, but it does suggest that spending more money on transit means you're going to grow slower because you're imposing a higher tax burden on your population. Now, the latest thing is bus rapid transit. Now, bus rapid transit sounds nice. It means you're running buses that only stop once a mile instead of once 5 or 6 times a mile, so they go faster. Maybe you pay before you get on board, so you don't have to wait for the driver to make sure that everybody's paid. Things like that can improve bus service, but lately the transit industry has been saying bus rapid transit is only real bus rapid transit if we dedicate lanes to the buses. And that's real expensive, and usually they take lanes away from cars and give them to the buses, and so it ends up causing a lot more congestion. Now, this is a bus rapid transit line in Istanbul, and you can see it's along a freeway. It's in the median strip of a freeway. They run buses up and down this line every 14 seconds during rush hour. Every 14 seconds. That's more than 250 buses an hour. Okay? Los Angeles has like the second or third highest transit ridership in the country. Los Angeles built a bus rapid transit line that has dedicated lanes, and during rush hour, they run buses down these dedicated lanes once every 4 minutes. So that means the dedicated lanes are running 95% empty compared to the Istanbul line. Once every 14 seconds versus once every 240 seconds, you're wasting all that space. Unless you can generate hundreds of buses an hour, and there's actually a bus lane in New York City that runs 700 buses an hour during rush hour. Unless you can generate that many buses, you should not have dedicated lanes. Maybe HOV lanes or managed lanes, high occupancy toll lanes, and then run the buses down there, but not dedicated bus lanes. Now, all this talk of spending money on transit is especially crazy because transit ridership is rapidly declining in almost every urban area in the United States. And it's declining whether we're talking about bus or rail, whether we're talking about big cities, medium-sized cities, or small urban areas. It's declining everywhere. There's 1 or 2 exceptions that I can get into if you want to, but we'll save that for Q&A. The yellow decline is from 2014 to 2017. The red decline is the first 5 months of 2018 versus the first 5 months of 2017. It appears the declines are actually accelerating in many places. Here is the decline in Hillsborough, Pasco, and Pinellas counties, and then Tampa, St. Pete as a whole. More than 15% decline since 2014. Now, transit agencies get about 1/3 of their operating money from their fare revenues. So if they're losing 1/3 of their fare revenues, that means they're losing more than 10% of their operating funds. And that's a big hit. So they come and say, we need more money so we can improve transit. What they're really saying is, we need more money just so we can maintain it because we're losing so many riders. Now, transit ridership is declining in places that have spent enormous amounts of money on transit improvements. So improving transit isn't going to save you from losing transit riders. All it's going to do is enrich the companies that make money improving transit. Here's some corroborative data. This is the Census Bureau. They estimate the number of people who take transit to work, and it's been steadily declining since 2014 in Tampa, St. Pete. Now, what's really going to kill transit is something that's going to happen in the next 3 or 4 years, and that is, well, first of all, what's killing transit today is ride-hailing. According to the best data available, 2017 saw 700 million more ride-sharing trips than 2016. transit ridership declined by about 250 million. So if only 36% of the people using Uber and Lyft would otherwise have ridden transit, that means all of the decline in transit is due to ride hailing. So I think we can expect to see that to continue. Of course, what they're saying is, let's tax Uber and Lyft and give the money to transit. Well, that's such a good idea. That would be like, let's tax Microsoft Word and use it to subsidize the typewriter industry. Let's tax every new pocket calculator that's sold and use it to subsidize the slide rule industry. Because that's a vital industry. We have to keep that industry going. But what's really going to kill it is driverless ride hailing. Now, let's see if I can do this. Nope. Come on. Play. There we go. Okay. This is Waymo's ride hailing. This is in actual service in Arizona. People are able to call up Waymo, have a driverless car come to their door and take them to where they want to go. Waymo, which used to be called Google, took 6 years to have their driverless cars go 1 million miles. Now they're doing 1 million miles a month. They haven't had any serious accidents, and none of the ones they've had were the fault of the driverless cars. It was usually somebody rear-ending them at a stoplight or something like that. So this is, by 2021, we're going to be seeing this in cities all across the country. Ford, Waymo, General Motors, and a bunch of other companies are all competing to be the first in every city. So that's going to be the death of transit. I'm optimistic that by 2030, transit agencies are going to be zombie agencies existing only to pay off their debts and to meet their unfunded pension and healthcare obligations, but not to actually move people around. Karen's already given you a plug for Gridlock. I have a new book coming out in October called Romance of the Rails, about rail transportation, both intercity and urban rail transit. I'm very pleased with that book. I have a copy here you can look at if you want to. And if you don't want to buy these books, you can go to the Cato website and download. I've got more than 24 papers on the Cato website, including one called The Coming Transit Apocalypse, about the decline of the transit industry. Thank you very much.